Okay, welcome back to the FantasyLabs podcast. This is Bryan. I am very pleased to be joined by a guest who's been on podcasts with us before. He's done some NFL podcasts with us. He's been on some evergreen stuff. In general, just an awesome dude, one of the brightest minds in fantasy football and in DFS. My buddy Chris Raybon. Chris, what's going on, dude?
What's good, Bryan? Thanks for having me on. Appreciate the kind words.
Yeah, man, of course. So the topic of this podcast is going to be how to transition from season-long NFL fantasy football to NFL DFS. I think there's a lot of people out there. I mean, there's millions and millions of people who play season-long fantasy football. It's there's shows about it with the league. It's sort of just a cultural thing in America and really everywhere. And it's such a big thing. NFL DFS is a little bit smaller, but it's growing, and there's a lot of people who want to bridge the gap. They've played NFL in season-long fantasy and want to get into daily and see these big prize pools and see their friends having fun with it and want to know what it's all about and some general strategies. And this podcast is going to be designed to help try to figure out, what you need to do if you've played season long, how to get into DFS, the similarities between the two, the differences between the two, and just some general NFL DFS things. And of course, Chris is a perfect guest for this. So we're going to jump right in. All right. So Chris, I think the first thing that people think about when they think of season long NFL is the drafts. That's sort of the fun part of season-long fantasy football is that you get to draft, whether it's a snake draft where you are, just picking in order, a guy has the first pick, and then you have second pick and it snakes back around to you, or an auction draft where you're all sitting there with your buddies and you can just bid on the price of the player. The highest bid gets that player. We don't necessarily have those things, but I think that there are some similarities and differences. We have sort of similar dynamics. Let's start with like an auction draft. We don't necessarily have, an auction draft, but there is pricing players and their salary cap. What are the similarities and differences, and perhaps, something a player can, equate to their auction draft in DFS?
It's a great question. So the similarities are with both an auction draft and DFS, you are essentially building a roster and you have a salary cap to do it with, and you have to build the best roster with that salary cap. Now, the difference is that in auctions, I kind of equate that pricing more to ownership in DFS rather than pricing to pricing, because in DFS, pricing is actually static, as in the site will set the price in a given week, and it'll change every week, but in that week, you can't change it. Whereas in an auction draft, obviously, you could bid up a player. So a player, if you want to pay $100 out of your $200 salary cap for one player, you can do that. So in DFS, ownership is kind of like auction value because it's perceived value. It's the value that you and your opponent are placing on a certain player. So those are really the similarities and differences the way I would see it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, it's about the popularity or the perceived value of that player, and that is definitely a good comparison. You had in our notes and sort of just before we got onto this podcast live, you talked about ADP, and this is something that people who are playing these MFL 10s and these popular things who are drafting ahead of time, have even been drafting for a couple of months now. ADP is average draft position, and it's just a quick way to see like where that player is going in average in the draft. You can see that on ESPN or Yahoo, wherever you're drafting. Even RotoViz, a site like that, has apps where you can see a player's ADP and how that changes over time. Where does that factor in these snake drafts? We can sort of transition to that in DFS.
Definitely. So, in regular season-long drafts, your average draft position is kind of like your price in DFS. So, for example, I was just telling you I'm actually working on an article for 4 for 4 where what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the week 1 FanDuel pricing versus redraft ADP. So, for example, if a wide receiver, like say Dante Moncrief is the wide receiver 40 in terms of pricing on FanDuel, but he is the wide receiver 25 in regular ADP, that shows that there's somewhat of a mispricing there. And the thing with DFS is that a player's price won't necessarily correct itself in 1 week. So a guy that's that undervalued, where there's that big of a discrepancy, he might be undervalued for the first 4, 5, 6 weeks of the season. I think a good example of that in 2015 was a guy like Eric Decker on FanDuel, especially, where it seemed like every week he was getting 70, 80 yards and a touchdown. But because, he started the season, I think he was like an 8th round draft pick or so. And every week his price was in the high 60s or the low 70s. And it really took a while for it to correct itself into the high end wide receiver 2 that he basically was last season. So something like that is really good. If you're used to playing redraft, you can kind of just take a look at ADPs and then kind of equate that with, okay, what is a player's price, and see the rankings, and that'll give you an idea of where to find value in DFS.
Yeah, that's interesting. I thought about a similar article like that. Do you think you can look at it also the opposite, like trying to find where people would be potentially biased with in week 1? Because I think people coming into season-long NFL are just so it's so ingrained in their mind, because you invest so much money, whether it's a top round pick or whether it's $80 of your $200 salary cap on a singular player, whether that's Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham, or whether it's a high priced running back like Jamal Charles, whatever. So you play those guys every week, regardless of their matchup, right? You never fade those guys in favor of a less talented guy with a different matchup. Whereas in DFS, that's not really how it works, right? Especially in cash games, you have to be very matchup oriented, as opposed to just like, okay, I'm going to play this guy just because I've invested so much into him. There's not really an investment.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Especially if you're not playing in a lot of season-long leagues, like maybe you have 2 or 3 leagues that you play in every year. And I think a lot of people can kind of start to target the same kind of players in all their leagues. And they might say, oh, I got Jamal Charles in the 2nd round in all 3 of my leagues. Like, what a steal. He's a first rounder. And then so you go into DFS in week 1 and you're playing Jamal Charles, but he might just not be in a good matchup. He might just not be the best value, because especially with running backs, in season-long, I know the 0 RB strategy is getting popular now, but especially in standard leagues, a lot of people still are drafting those running backs early and often. And in DFS, that's kind of not really the correct strategy. In DFS, the first thing you always want to do in DFS is really find the cheap running backs that are going to get volume, because a running back's production in fantasy is mostly dependent on his opportunity. He might not necessarily be a great running back, but if he's slated to get 15, 18, 20 touches in a game and his price is on the low end of the salary spectrum, he'll be a very good investment. And if you're foregoing those players to pay up at running back, you're probably missing out on a lot of stud wide receivers, where that's a position where you actually want to pay up, because not all of the receivers are consistent, and you want to kind of pay up for some consistency there. A guy like Antonio Brown or Julio Jones, who kind of approach 10 targets almost every week. So that can actually play a large role. And also something else I noticed is just early season ADP really has an effect on early season DFS ownership. For example, last season in DFS, I noticed way too many people playing Eddie Lacy and CJ Anderson in like the first month of the season. And it was kind of clear early on that they weren't going to be who we thought they were. But if you invested, a first round pick in maybe one or even one league, but 2, 3 of your leagues, you believe in these guys, and you're going to keep, you see their salary going down. Right. And because they're obviously playing bad, you see their salary going down, and you're like, this is a steal. I got to play this guy. And I think that costs a lot of people a lot of money. So that's also a really good point about, we have these biases just because of average draft position that we take with us into DFS, and you have to be careful of that.
Yeah, that's definitely a great point. Always something I look at first week of the season in DFS is where you can get away from the public, just because people have very strong biases about certain players. And it's something like ADP I think is a good way to identify those for sure. One thing that people get so frustrated about in season-long fantasy, and one thing that I guess is just a major selling point for DFS, is that it's not that you don't have to deal with injuries in DFS, because you do, and we'll get into that in just one second. But it doesn't just screw your season. There's nothing worse than taking a high price running back, or investing a high draft pick into a running back, and him going down in the first week, and then all of a sudden you're just in trouble. He has no trade value if it's a redraft league, and what are you going to do with that? If you don't have his handcuff, or you don't have waiver wire position, then you're just sort of done for that year. DFS, you don't have to worry about that, but that sort of makes people think that you don't have to worry about injuries at all, which in fact, and I think you alluded to this earlier, you really have to worry about injuries, because probably the most important thing you can do in DFS is take advantage of injury situations with running backs. Do you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. We already went over it. Any injury is going to create a situation where there's going to be his cheaper backup is going to be thrust into a role where he'll probably get at least 15 touches in a game. And, we saw this last year, Devontae Freeman, you could have rode Devontae Freeman for about a good 5-6 week stretch when he first took over, and you would have probably profited every week just by playing him. Then D'Angelo Williams, if you rode him for like the rest of the season. I mean, just those two guys alone, their prices really never caught up until, maybe week 15. So you kind of had the whole season to just ride these guys. And then there was guys like Jeremy Langford for a couple of weeks, and Charkandrick West for a couple of weeks, and Spencer Ware for a couple of weeks. And, the names are endless. And these guys, again, I know some of the redraft players probably won't really have an idea about some of these lesser known backups. They might not think they're that good, or they might have been a backup for a reason. But it's the same thing as handcuffing, really. It's when a guy goes down, you want his handcuff, even if he's not as good, just because he's going to get that opportunity. And it's the same thing in DFS with the added bonus of his price. Just as a handcuff, usually his draft position is very low. He's cheap in a draft. In DFS, a backup running back filling in for injury will be very cheap as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where it gets into ownership. And let's just spend a little bit talking about that. I think that is probably the most difficult thing for people to get used to in DFS, more so than just the salary cap. I think people sort of just innately understand a salary cap and the math behind that. You only have this much money to allocate, so you have to make a lineup. That's fine. We do that with an auction draft. You're right that the price is a little bit different in that, price could be ownership. All that's fine. But like the general understanding of you only have this much money to spend on a lineup or a roster of players is sort of, that's understood by season long. But the thing that isn't necessarily, and it takes a little adjustment, is ownership. And which is just, the percentage in a tournament or cash games or whatever contest you're in, the percentage of amount of people that roster that specific player. And that's just sort of a mind-blowing concept at first when you get into DFS. It's just, okay, like I can take a guy, but everyone else can take this same guy. And, how do you deal with that sort of situation? What would you say to first-time users just like trying to get their mind around ownership and like not get overwhelmed by the fact that a guy's going to be 60% owned?
Well, yeah, it is a new concept, and I think first thing you have to realize is that because of this, there's ownership is going to play a different role in different types of games. So in cash games, which are your safe games where you have roughly 1 in 2 chance to win, where it's like a head-to-head and you either win or you lose, or it's a double up where you win about 40% of the time, you double your money or something like that. Ownership, you're probably going to have a bunch of players that are on the high spectrum of ownership because those are just going to be the best values in a given week, and the smartest DFS players are going to roster those guys no matter what. But in a tournament where maybe only the top 10% or 20% of entrants get paid out, you want to finish at the top of the top there, and the payouts get higher as you get higher up in the standing. So if you finish first, you get the grand prize. If you're on DraftKings, that might be $1 million or whatever. So to have the best lineup out of a few thousand people, you really need to. That means having a different lineup. You can't just have the same lineup as everyone else. You're not going to finish that high. So in that situation, what you kind of need to do is you need to be thinking about how popular players are going to be before the contest, and then almost purposely go against the grain at certain points. Now, it doesn't mean you go against the grain at every single position. I did kind of a study on this where I looked at the winning lineups on FanDuel and DraftKings for the big tournaments, and I found that usually there's one wide receiver and one running back that will have a high ownership percentage. But that's about it. Like, you're usually not going to get away with like having all three of your receivers being owned in one every three lineups. So that's really where ownership comes into play a lot. You have to kind of figure out how to leverage it to the best of your advantage, depending on what contest you're playing in. And in a cash game, it can be the reverse sometimes. Like, you can know a player is going to be highly owned, and that can actually give you a reason to play him. You can say, okay, well, if I think this guy's the best value and he's going to be in a lot of lineups, like, at least if there's no one else I see comparable, I'll play him. And if he goes down, I'm going down with everybody else, and I might still have a chance to win because he's in 7 out of 10 lineups, or 5, one in every 2 lineups. So you still have a chance to win in a cash game. But tournaments, you generally want a low owned lineup.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just about, and this is always important. We'll get into game selection at the a little bit later in this podcast, but it definitely is important to look at it at a tournament or a contest, whether it's a cash game, which is cash game just means 50% of the field gets their money back, or doubles up their money, whereas in tournaments it's a smaller percent. You can be 10%, 12%. It really just depends. These sites offer a lot of different ones. Obviously, yeah, ownership matters in those tournaments, because if 30% of the field have a guy who scores 2 touchdowns, that's great. But if only 10% makes money, you're still not in the money just by rostering that guy. And also, I think another important thing, and I think a lot of people miss this right away, is the ownership number that matters is your lineup. You have to roster, a quarterback. You have to roster 2 running backs. You have to roster some wide receivers, a tight end, defensive kicker if you're on FanDuel. The total ownership matters of that lineup. You can, and like you said, you can roster a low-priced running back in a tournament and still have a unique lineup by rostering different guys. I think that's important. Do you think people miss that? I feel like it's just something that people just completely miss all the time.
Yeah, you know what it is, because it goes into probability. So if for people that really understand probabilities, you'll probably understand this a bit more. But if you have say a guy with a 50% ownership percentage and another guy with a 1% ownership percentage, you can multiply those two, and the amount of lineups with both of those guys in will probably be lower. Where if you have 2 guys with like 25 each, it actually might be higher. So. Right. So, you can, like I said, you can go off the map at just a couple of positions and your overall lineup will be very differentiated. Like, maybe you can have a pretty highly owned lineup, but you just have this one player that it's like literally in like nobody else's lineup. And that alone, in certain cases, maybe in a smaller slate, that might be enough. It really does come down to the whole lineup. I think some people miss that point, like you said. And what they do is instead they build a whole lineup of contrarian selections, and that can work at certain times, but sometimes there's not always enough contrarian selections that are going to pay off. Like, you also have to keep that in mind. Like, the guys that are highly owned for a reason. They still are the best value. So sometimes what I like to do is, I will just, if there's going to be, say, 10 receivers that are probably going to be owned maybe more than 10%, maybe I'll just fade the top 1 or 2. And, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th guy might be, fine in that situation. It really is about your whole lineup being unique, and not just, if every player is unique, you're probably just selecting suboptimal players, and that you're probably minus EV anyway. So it really is important to know that your whole lineup needs to be unique, and not just have a whole bunch of low-owned players for no reason.
Yeah, for sure. And, I sort of realized, talking with you in this podcast, there's a lot of DFS-specific lingo that is, you just have to pick up. A fade is not something you do in season long. You just don't fade a guy. You can only roster the players on your roster. Fade just means, you're not going to roster that guy. But I would really just encourage, dive into the DFS community, read. There's a lot of good stuff on 4for4 where you write, Chris, FantasyLabs where I write. We have a lot of stuff, learn the lingo and dive into strategy articles for sure. It'll definitely help you get up to speed. There's so much good content out there nowadays that can help you get up to speed on top of this podcast. One thing that we've sort of danced around here, but it's just such an overwhelming factor just right away for season long people is okay. And FanDuel just released their pricing today. This morning we're recording this on Monday night, which is the 1st of August. They just released their pricing now. And one thing, if a person goes in and says, okay, I'm going to set a lineup, I'm going to get into DFS. Oh my God, there's so many players. Like, what do I even do here? Like, at least in season long DFS, I draft my players, and then I don't have to worry about picking but between 15 guys, if you're playing in sort of a larger league. Whereas DFS, you have literally everyone in the NFL that you can choose from to make a lineup. As a guy who plays, DFS every week, Chris, how do you deal with just the sheer number of players available to you?
I think weekly projections become a lot more important because you just want to have a starting point. And that doesn't mean you just blindly follow projections, but you want to have projections, and you want to be able to, when I say projections, I mean the projected amount of points that a player is going to score depending on that site scoring system. And you want to be able to divide that by their salary to get a kind of value number. So for every player now, you have a spreadsheet where you kind of can see, who are the best values just by the numbers alone. And then you kind of, you just have to, you have to jump into the matchups, and there are shortcuts you can take once you can look at the Vegas lines. I think those are really important because Vegas puts out a point spread, which is, how many points a team is going to win or lose by. And they put out an over-under, which is how many total points are going to be scored in the game. Because they put out those two things, they're in essence predicting a score for each game. Mm-hmm. And of course, especially in today's NFL, in 2015, about 69% of offensive touchdowns were passing, and about 69% of offensive yardage was passing. So when a team has a higher point total, usually anything over about 24 is pretty good. Mm-hmm. That means that benefits everyone in their passing game. So sometimes you'll see there'll be really bad defenses, and a team that isn't usually that, you don't think of them as a high scoring team, will have a high point total, and you can look at that, and that's kind of a shortcut you can take. And of course you also want to have your chart. I know FantasyLabs has the positional plus minuses, which is basically how many points above or below normal does a defense give up to each position based on salary. And at 4for4, we have something similar, schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, which, basically both of them are adjusting for strength of schedule. And I think you really want to do that when you look at a matchup. You want to be able to adjust for the strength of the schedule, because if not, a defense could face Teddy Bridgewater and Alex Smith for 2 games, and another one could face Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers, and they would, you'd be, if you didn't have schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, you'd be comparing them just, you would treat all 4 of those guys as equal, where they're really not equal. So things like that, fantasy schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, the Vegas lines, and just having some projections and being able to divide by salary are 3 really good shortcuts you can get into. And then of course, as you get better at DFS, get more of a feel for it, you can start diving deeper into matchups, because say it's week 1 and you're diving into all the week 1 matchups. That'll help you going forward. So for example, if you're looking at, say, a cornerback matchup between a wide receiver and a cornerback, in week 1, now you understand more about that cornerback for the next few weeks, and you'll see how that wide receiver did. And different wide receivers have different skills, and there's, of course, the offensive line, and if a team has a good pass rush, will a tight end or running back have to block more, which means he'll catch less passes. And some players are better against zone, like a tight end might be able to just sit down on 5-yard button hooks against zones, but if they're playing man-to-man defense against a safety, they might not be able to beat that safety. So there's a lot of levels you can really dive in as you get more experience. But I think the main thing is to kind of know the main things, like the defense and the Vegas lines, and just the overall value, because that's what everyone else is going to be looking at too. And so, like you said, ownership is so important, and that's another part of DFS, is not just picking the right players. It's understanding what other people are going to do, because sometimes you could have a relatively poor lineup, but other people could even be worse. Like sometimes you'll be looking at your lineup and like, oh man, like I suck this week. And then you look at your head-to-heads and you're winning like 70% of them, and you realize that even though, it's just a low-scoring week, and,
sure,
you had good process, and so you could still come out on top.
Yeah, I agree. Vegas is sort of the, not to get too simplistic with things, but Vegas is, they have so much money coming in on bets, and they set these lines that people can bet, and like it's definitely in their interest. Like they wouldn't exist if they weren't really good at what they do, which is to set accurate lines. And it's not only the sort of the best way to figure out how many points are going to be scored and thus get projections on players. It's also the most efficient way. Like you and I are full-time fantasy people, but we not going to pretend that everyone in listening to this podcast necessarily has hours and hours every week. That's just not realistic, and I get that, and I respect that for sure. So I think looking at Vegas, like I would definitely encourage you to look at sites and content, because there's a lot of good stuff that people write that can help break down the slates and the players. But if you're just sort of doing research yourself, it's not only about doing research, it's about doing efficient research. And Vegas is the easy way to do that. And so not to be too simplistic with it, but just simply targeting high total games for your cash games is sort of, I think, the best way to just like start your week. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, high totals. And another thing is just favorites over underdogs. Like I can give you some numbers that I jotted down. Like, for example, over the last 3 years, favorites averaged 28 carries, 117 yards, and 0.87 rushing touchdowns, whereas underdogs, 26 carries, only 104 yards, and only 0.63 rushing touchdowns. So you're looking at just rushing without even counting any running backs receptions or anything. You're looking at a good 4 or 5 points of just difference. Just favorite underdog without even accounting for anything else. And then you look at something like a team defense. A lot of people don't really know exactly how to choose a defense or special team. Some people just choose like a really cheap option because they think it doesn't matter. Some people feel uncomfortable with anyone but like the most expensive. But if you just take a favorite, favorites are allowing only 20.2 points a game over the last 3 years, where underdogs are allowing 25.6. Favorites are getting 3.54 ints plus sacks per game, where underdogs are only getting 3.09. And then, so, just simple things like that. Quarterbacks perform a lot better as favorites than as underdogs, in addition to the high team. And of course, the favorites are going to have the higher team totals. So that goes into that about, targeting those high totals. But, just looking at, it's because, and when I gave you these favorite and underdog splits, if you actually look at the winning teams versus losing teams in the NFL, like the winner versus the loser, the discrepancies are even bigger. So if you actually are like, Vegas is great because, Vegas is the best way to kind of predict winners and losers. But, if you want to even get deeper, if you're just trying to, you think you even have an edge over Vegas at certain points where you think a team is going to win that Vegas maybe doesn't, winners, it's a really big discrepancy. And that's where the fantasy points are coming from. It's coming from the teams that are winning. The average NFL game, the score is 28-17, which surprises people. It's not very close. Winning teams routinely score 30 points in a game. And you're looking at 4 or 5 touchdowns. Right. That means that's probably 3 for the quarterback and 1 for the running back, or 1 for the defense or something like that. Which means even if you're choosing top wide receivers on a team, they have a pretty good chance of getting one of those touchdowns. So it's just, Vegas lines are extremely helpful. Like you said, the most efficient way to really plan your week. If you are, if you're overwhelmed by all the players, you can just literally cross certain games completely off your list for certain positions. Like obviously for the defenses, you want kind of the lower scoring games,
right?
And running backs, you kind of might be okay with like a lower scoring game if they're a big favorite. But with the passing game, quarterbacks, tight ends, and wide receivers, those high scoring games are money.
Yeah, and then, I would definitely encourage to start there every week. And especially if you're just getting into DFS, definitely start with Vegas lines and just like regular defensive stats like you mentioned. And you're right, there's stuff that you can get into, whether it's like cornerback versus wide receiver matchups, or like really like monitoring snap counts and like which fourth string wide receivers seeing a sudden uptick in snap count this week. That's like insider stuff that like the best players are going to. But in general, if you're getting into it, I would say, like wait on that stuff. Like you can get into that later. Once you sort of up your bankroll a little bit and expand your game selection. But in general, you're right. I think Vegas and just the basic defensive stats are really just a great way to get into DFS and great way to play cash games for sure. One thing I do want to talk about, Chris, and just because it's such a huge part of DFS, but it's really nowhere to be found in season long, and something that they're new players are really going to have to adjust to, is let's say you're in a snake draft in season long, like, and you, I don't know, like, what's an example? I don't even know two players that would be close. Let's say like Devontae Freeman and Julio Jones are like similar, like sort of ADPs. They're not really, but like let's hypothetically say that they are. And you're like, okay, well, just my place in the draft. I'm not going to take Devontae in the second round because I already have Julio in the first round. That sort of idea of taking two players from the same team is sort of a no-no in season long, just because you're wrapping all of your points up into one team. But in NFL DFS, stacking, which is, that word just means taking two players, or it could be three players, or it could be really any number of players or positions from the same team in a single lineup, is a really good strategy. What are your thoughts on, I know that you're probably pro stacking, but, what are your thoughts on using it maybe in cash games and tournaments and just in general?
Yeah, so I'm pro. It's funny you said I'm pro stack. I'm actually pro stacking in season long as well. Just to go back to that point, like, I don't think, if you come to a player that's a good value at his average draft position, like if you got Devontae Freeman at the end of the second and you value him as an early second rounder, sure, then I think you take him. I don't think because it's at the end of the day, it's just about outscoring your opponent. And if those two guys are that high in the first place, it's because last year, right, yeah. Freeman was a number one receiver and Freeman was the number one running back and Julio was the number 2 or 3 receiver. So right. I'm pro stacking in season long as well. But yeah, in DFS, stacking, basically what we really look at is we look at these correlations between each position in the game. And of course, a quarterback is going to be highly correlated with all of his receivers. His primary receiver, obviously more than others. And then to take advantage of that, what you do is, especially in tournaments, you select a quarterback and maybe one or two of other players on his team, and that way, you're kind of, it's kind of a little riskier, but if your quarterback and your wide receiver hit, you've kind of you've kind of killed two birds with one stone. Like, you don't have to go and like choose all these 3 different wide receivers, and then that the quarterback you chose might have hit, and then you don't really take advantage of it with your wide receivers. So stacking is very important in tournaments. Almost every winning tournament lineup has some sort of stack. So yeah, I mentioned the top ones are of course quarterback and receivers, but what a lot of people might not know, and I actually did a really huge study on this, and it'll be coming out in mid-August on 4 for 4. I did one for FanDuel, one for DraftKings, but I basically looked at the correlations of every position, and not only that, but what happens when a quarterback has a big game, for example, because the correlations, when you're looking at correlations of players over the entire season of every game, of course they're going to kind of even out a little bit, right. But okay, what happens when a quarterback scores 25 points on DraftKings? Then what are the other positions on his team doing? So, and what I really found, what I think was the thing that a lot of people are scared off by, is that besides the quarterback's primary wide receiver, the second best player to stack a quarterback with is his running back. Yeah. And a lot of people kind of go away from that. They're like, oh, well, if I stack a quarterback, then the running back is going to be negatively correlated because, it's a passing or rushing touch. But in reality, what happens is, when a quarterback does well, that means the offense is doing well with player on that offense, including the running back. So if a team puts up, say, 35 or 40 points and you have the quarterback and the running back, you're probably get all of the team's passing touchdowns and all of their rushing touchdowns. So if they 3 or 4 or 5, you're in business. So that's one. Running back defense stacks can be useful because when a defense is successful, that means more carries for the running back because the team is probably ahead. You can have defense kicker for the same reason, quarterback kicker on FanDuel, same reason. But yeah, and then I look at like the effectiveness of, say, a 2-man stack with quarterback and a receiver versus a 3-man stack, and I found that 2-man stacks are by far the most effective. And once you start going up in the stacks, like 3-man, 4-man stacks, like a lot of people will do, say, a quarterback and 2 of his receivers or a quarterback and 3 of his receivers, but I found that like the running back should actually always be included in those stacks. Yeah. So it's like quarterback running back wide receiver, or quarterback running back 2 wide, something like that. Those are kind of the best stacks. And as far as cash games, I'm fine with stacking in cash games. I understand the counterpoint to stacking in cash games is that you don't want to, like you said with season long, you don't want to wrap all of you don't want to put so much risk on one team.
Right.
But the thing is, as we talked about with these Vegas lines, in a given week, there are only going to be so many offenses that have high projected totals that are going to do well. And, and on top of that, say there are maybe 5 offenses that you think are going to do really well. Well, this is DFS and you're still looking for value. So there might only be 1 or 2 of those offenses that are priced at a point because they might be like maybe an average team just facing a really bad defense. So in this given week, their whole team is just underpriced. So there's no way that I'm not going to forego that value just to diversify. I think I'd rather lower my risk and diversify in terms of my opponent. So, for example, in cash games, I'm fine with playing 1 cash game lineup for the whole week, but it's just that I'll play in head-to-heads versus 100 different people. So some of those people I'll be better than. Some of those people will be better than me. Hopefully I'm better than more than, enough to make a profit. But I think that's kind of the preferred strategy for lowering your risk in cash games versus just taking suboptimal players just because you're trying to avoid 2 players on the same team. Like if David Johnson and Carson Palmer and John Brown are all great values in a given week, if those are the best values, I think for my cash game lineup, I'm putting them in there regardless. Like I don't, I think that's just the best way to go because again, like you also, people think that just because you're trying to maximize your floor in cash game that like upside doesn't matter, but upside still matters in cash games too. Like, if you're playing in head to heads, you might get unlucky in a week. You might play a bunch of other good opponents and you need that upside to make sure you still win. You can't just play it super safe. And I don't think if you're putting money on your football knowledge in the first place, you necessarily want to play it super safe either. Like you're somewhat confident. So I think you should play like that. I think you should play to win and play not to lose. And there's other ways to lower risk besides just avoiding stacking in cash games.
Yeah, that's very fair. And to be clear, cash games are usually divided up into either head-to-head matchups, which is what people are used to playing in season long, which is just you versus a single opponent, and whoever wins doubles up their money, minus the rake, of course. Whereas there's another sort of cash game where you're in a contest with either 3 people or it could be thousands of people, and just half of the field doubles up their money. So, if you are, if there's 100 players, if you're 49th out of that 100, you still double up your money, even if you're first, or regardless of whether you're first. In head-to-head, it's just 1 versus 1. So you're right. You can have some upside in your lineup, especially in head-to-heads, because it's all about where your percentile rank of your lineup is. So if you play, let's say you theoretically play 1 million cash game lineups versus versus 1 million different people. If your lineup is in the 60th percentile, you're going to cash in 60% of those lineups. Whereas if you play like a double up, 1 million double ups, you're going to still cash only in 50% of your lineups.
Right. And to be clear, like when I said, that's why when I'm saying like I'm okay with playing 1 lineup in cash games, I'm saying because I'm playing head to head. Like if I were playing 50-50s, which I think 50-50s and head to heads are actually, just because they're both cash games, I think people kind of think they're very similar when they're actually not, because they're very different risks. So I don't even treat 50-50s as like these low risk like cash games. What I do with 50-50s is I usually play 1 cash game lineup and I play it in all head to heads, and then I'll play a lot of tournament lineups. And what I usually do with like 50-50s and contests like that, like triple ups where you need to hit a certain point, a threshold, is I usually just play my tournament lineups in a bunch of 50-50. So it's like I'll have maybe 20 different lineups each in a 50-50, and that way, because even if I'm not going to cash on all my tournament lineups, like getting in the top maybe 10-15%, I'm still expecting my lineups to do reasonably well enough to finish in the top 50%, but I don't want to play 1 lineup in like every 50-50, and then if it finishes like you said in the 49th percentile, I'm at $0, so I think I think that's something, I would kind of suggest for like newer DFS players. I think to like play more head to heads if you're looking for lower cash games, and then like with those be careful with those 50-50s and those double ups, because they seem so tempting and so easy, but you can get in a lot of trouble. And not even if you're playing the same lineup, but we talked about this earlier, if you just have, because you can, it's about how much you own the player, how much you're exposed to that player. And also even if you have like maybe 3 or 4 of the same players in every one of your lineups, and you play a bunch of different lines, you could still be in the red if those players don't do well. So I think 50-50s are a lot riskier.
Yeah.
To realize. I think people are kind of looking for that easy way to cash, and I think to really do that, you want to kind of diversify your opponents. So you give yourself some cushion. If you have a bad week and you finish, say, in the 25th percentile, you're still cashing in roughly 25% of your games theoretically, whereas you would have cashed in 0, 50-50s, double ups, etc.
Yeah, and I think it also depends on how much you're playing. Like if you only have if you're going to play $1
right
in a week, and you can, like, DraftKings and FanDuel have very low stakes that you can play for free, or just $1 or $2. If you only have $1, so you just want to play like one lineup, you don't want to play a tournament, you just want to play a cash game, like in that sense you want to play a 50-50.
Yeah.
Like you just need to hit you should be in the top 50 percentile, but as you play more, let's say you put in you want to enter your lineup into 100 different contests as opposed to just one, then you're right, it gets more advantageous to play head-to-head because it minimizes your risk. If your lineup's in the 30th percentile and you're playing 100 head-to-heads, you still get 30% of your money back. You don't lose all of it. Whereas in double-ups, you lose every penny of it, which is definitely not fun. I'm interested in your thoughts, and we'll wrap this up in just a little bit. Don't want to go too long. What are your thoughts on just bigger slates for smaller slates? And just to be real quick, a slate is that just means that the games in that particular contest. So they these sites offer different slates, so you can play in the main slate, which is all of Sunday's games up through Monday night. You could also play in smaller slates where there's a primetime slate, was what they call it, and that's just the Sunday night games plus the Monday night games, and those are obviously only just a couple games, whereas the Sunday games are double digits, 14, 15 games. What are your thoughts on a beginner playing the bigger ones versus smaller ones?
I think as a beginner, the smaller slates are going to kind of lend themselves better to beginner's luck, because they're on these large slates. We talked about this earlier. There's so many. You could dive so deep into matchups if you really want to. And on those larger slates, the sharper players are going to probably have an advantage over the beginners because they're just going to know more about more matchups, and they're going to find more situations to exploit. They're going to find probably more lower salary players to exploit and to use, and because of that, they'll probably also be able to fit more studs in their lineup. But in these smaller slates, there's just a more limited supply of players, so that kind of that increases the luck element of DFS. So I think definitely if you're a beginner, try your hand at maybe a 1 o'clock slate only, a 4 o'clock slate, like you said, the prime time slate, and just kind of get your feet wet in that, and you can kind of see how just you can kind of look at your lineup and then look at other people's lineups, and there probably won't even be that many different lineups. You can kind of scroll through the standings and you'll see almost all the different possible lineups, and you can kind of get a sense of okay, what was kind of the make or break here? What did people do, to have success? Did they overpay for this defense and that screwed up their whole lineup? And, you can kind of understand, where you went wrong on a smaller scale if you did go wrong, or you can benefit from some beginner's luck. So I definitely recommend starting out there. And then as you get more comfortable, start building up to maybe a large, the 1 o'clock slate is usually a larger slate than the other slates. And then eventually you can start playing in all of them. And I think Thursday slates are another one where I think if you're a beginner and you want to play a large slate, Thursday slates are kind of good because I think a lot of the sharper players haven't necessarily done all their research yet. So they might not necessarily. A lot of sharp players aren't usually necessarily in the Thursday contest unless they're doing all their research by Thursday. So what happens is you get a lot of people on Thursday who roster the players in the Thursday night game. And sometimes it gets ridiculous. Like it'll be like a Bills-Dolphins game and it'll be a full slate, like Thursday to Sunday. And yet, Ryan Tannehill and Tyrod Taylor will each be like, in one in every like 6 or 7 lineups, which they would never be in if that game was on a Sunday. So you can kind of benefit just from people. If you just want to get into a large slate and you're a beginner, get into the Thursday night games and just fade all the Thursday players. Even if you think some of them are good values, just fade them just for the purpose of because everyone else is going to overplay them anyway, and you might have some luck that way as well. Yeah, for sure. Those are definitely very good points. Okay, let's end just a little bit of talk about bankroll management. Because let's say you deposit $100 into whatever site, and these tournaments are going to look pretty enticing. I can put in $2 and I can win, $100,000 on first place prize or whatever it may be. And it's very easy to lose money. So what's your advice to people, as they get in, like, let's say, we definitely encourage people to play cash games, but let's just say, someone listening just says, no, I don't want to do that, Chris. I want to win the big money. I want to take home the grand prize. But I still don't want to just lose all my money in a single week. I still want to be semi-profitable. What would you say to that guy? To that guy, I would say when you play in tournaments, well, first of all, to back up, you have to know your actual bankroll, because there's some people that'll put $100 in, and that's all they'll put in. And there's some people that'll put $100 in, but they'll be willing to redeposit 10 times if they go broke. So your bankroll in that situation isn't really 100, it's 1,000, because you're willing to redeposit 10 times. So I think first of all, realistically assess what your real bankroll is, and then you still want to play only a percentage of that every week. So you could play maybe 15-20% of that. Depending, the lower it is, the higher number. For guys that are playing, tens of thousands of dollars, you probably might only play 5-10% of your bankroll. But if you only have $100, you might play 20, even 30% of your bankroll. Really just depends. But what I would say to that guy that you mentioned would be, okay, if you're gonna play, if you have $100, let's just say that's your real bankroll is $100. So you want to play 20, you play 20% of your bankroll. What I would suggest is don't just play one tournament. With $20. I would suggest actually playing in 10 $2 tournaments or even $21 tournaments, because what you're going to do then is what you can do is you can widen your player pool. So you can because you have all these different lineup options, you could start toying with these different combinations of players, and you can start playing players that you wouldn't have otherwise played if you only had one shot. So I think that's the way to kind of smooth over some of the potential risk of just playing only in tournaments. Is you want to have a little bit of a more diverse player pool, and you want to be playing in you don't want to just be playing in the highest entry fee. You want to kind of maximize to some extent the amount of tournaments you're playing, because that, again, in these tournaments, there is a luck element involved, and by having a bunch of lineups and by having a bunch of players that you might have not otherwise chosen, you can luck into things sometimes more than you luck out of, because your percent chance of winning a tournament or even cashing in a tournament is already only 20%. So there's already this big luck. You already have more to gain from luck than you have to lose in a way. Right. So I definitely suggest, that's one thing I think a lot of people don't get. They say, I'm only playing $10 a week, so I'm just going to play this one $10 tournament or two $5. No, play 10 $1 ones. If you could win one, and even though the payouts look kind of small when you're looking at them compared to the other ones, if you take a $1 tournament and you cash for $200-300, you're in a lot better place than you were when you started, and then you can slowly start graduating to the 2s and the 5s, and that's kind of what you want to do. You kind of want to level up, and as your bankroll grows, if you just get one big cash in one of those small ones, then you can go and say, okay, maybe I'll put one entry in the 25, and 2 in the 10, and 3 in the 5, and 4 $2, and you can do it that way. But at the start, I would really suggest staying in the lowest entry fees. And even if you're playing cash games, I think the same thing. If you have $20 to play, I would really suggest you play $1 head-to-heads, because again, you want to diversify your opponents. You don't want to play one $20 game and you just get one of just happen to either some guy gets lucky or he's really good or whatever it could be, and you just out your whole money. Where if you play $1 ones, you could win some, you could lose some, you'll stay in the game longer.
Yep. You stole all of my points as well. Great advice. Who are you most excited to roster this year in NFL DFS? What player?
Most excited, I would say. There's always a couple guys every week. I think Antonio Brown just every week.
He's so fun.
He's just, I don't think we've ever seen a receiver this good, since Jerry Rice, and then Odell Beckham is kind of right behind him. The only thing is, for some reason, he always seems to struggle against the Cowboys. So, and I think he plays them in week 1. So, but, Brown, Beckham, and Rob Gronkowski definitely are guys that every week it's just really fun. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, Antonio Brown's always the guy that comes to mind. Odell's fun, and everyone loves his hands, and he has so many vines of just snagging balls. Antonio Brown just makes people look silly on a play-to-play basis more than I've ever seen. I get the Jerry Rice comparison. I don't particularly remember watching him that much. He was a little before my time, but yeah, since I've been watching football, Antonio Brown just on an offensive side, you have J.J. Watt making people just look like they don't belong in the world, let alone the NFL. Antonio Brown's sort of like the offensive version of that, where it's just no one can do anything to him.
Yeah, and it's like a lot of people, because the way NFL games are kind of broadcast, if you're kind of a more casual observer, you probably don't even fully understand Antonio Brown's greatness. But when they show a replay and they just show him running a route, and he'll just fake one way and just run the other direction, and the defender will be over there, just out of the picture. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Oh, and this reminds me, I meant to ask you this and forgot to earlier. What are your thoughts on the eye test? Do you watch, on Sunday? Do you think it's important? Maybe you'd watch just for fun.
So I know this is a big divide amongst the fantasy analyst community, where it's it's stats versus film. I'll tell you that I'm a very big stats guy. I'm into all these advanced stats, and that being said, I watch. I've watched every play of every game for about the last 6-7 years.
Wow.
And I think that has really helped. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it helps, because I think it doesn't hurt, essentially, because it's not. And what I do is I just go on Game Rewind, and I'll watch the games on Sunday, and I'll be watching Red Zone and the nationally televised games. But what I'll do during the week is I'll go back on to Game Rewind, and I'll just watch the condensed version of each game, which takes about 20 to 30 minutes, and it's literally just play. It's every play with no downtime. So it's pretty efficient to watch, and just watching it, you kind of really, because there's all these arguments that come up with stats about who's good and who's not, and I know, for example, I know even a lot of casual players probably read Matthew Berry, and every year he writes this column where he kind of just gives stats about the same player, and he can paint them either really good or really bad just by choosing different stats. And I think that's sometimes watching the game just helps decipher between the signal and the noise. And even when you might be watching a game and you don't consciously think you're picking up anything useful, but unconsciously you're kind of just taking in all of this information that you're not processing at a conscious level, but that's still going into your brain, and that kind of can allow you to just make better decisions going forward, because you just know more about the players. You understand the feel of the game. You understand when a player puts up a certain great stats, is that repeatable, or was it just a freak play, a freak broken tackle? Did somebody fall down? Was it a situation that probably won't occur again? There's so many things. Or did the coaches trust in this guy? When are they calling his number? How fast is he really? How all these things that you can just take in by watching games, I think are very helpful. And I think NFL is the sport where I think watching honestly helps the most. Baseball, I
don't think it helps at all.
Right. It's really tough. And in basketball, it helps at certain times. You want to see, sometimes you need to I remember James Harden used to always, do badly against the Clippers for a while, and I didn't understand why. So I would go on NBA Game Pass, and I would watch, how the Clippers defended him. I was like, oh, well, this is why he's not doing good, because they would just defend him a certain way that would kind of limit his offense. And I think that's really where I'd say watching comes into play the most, is when there are stats that you just going back and forth, and you can't really explain them totally. Sometimes you can just go watch, and your questions are answered. Sometimes I'll do that, when it's like all these mid-range running backs, there's Jay Ajayi and there's Jeremy Langford, there's Matt Jones and there's Ryan Matthews. And it's like, everyone can have a stat for or against these guys. And sometimes you just got to go and block all that out and just, we already know statistically there's nothing really separate. Like they're all equal in some way. So it's like, just go watch a couple plays and, sometimes that can make your decision for you. So I think that's where it comes in. What about you? How you feel about it?
Yeah. I think it really just comes down to like the data available in a sport. Like in baseball, we have like StatCast data, so we know how fast a ball comes off of the bat and all that stuff. So like, I wrote an article on MLB Today, and like Carlos Correa, who's a shortstop for the Houston Astros, hit a ball that just like, it ended up being an out. But, just with probabilities and how fast it came off the bat and his launch angle, Darren Willman, who's a guy who has his own site, MLB Savant. He also does NFL Savant, which is a cool site. I'm getting sort of sidetracked here. Anyway, he calculated that particular hit that ended up being an out for Correa would have been a home run 94% of the time, and just gets unlucky. So like in MLB, like you just have so much data where like you don't have to watch, because like you have data on every single hit, on every single pitch, how fast the pitch is going. Like there's no part of the game that's not like able to be tracked. Whereas NFL, you're right. Like you do have like in NBA, you have like ways you can defend a guy, or like, offensive line play, defensive line play is something that we're getting better measuring. Cornerback, wide receiver, we're getting better measuring and putting stats to, but it's not 100% like as much as baseball. And I think that, watching, and I agree, like you're definitely a big stats guy. That's why we get along, because I am too. I don't think any stats guys like hate the eye test. We like both of them, Like we just think that like you have to use them in tandem. Like, all right, what did the stats say? Okay, and then where can I, what can I use the eye test to like help massage the data that I'm looking at?
Definitely, yeah. I think that's the hard part if you really want to get into it. But like again, like you said, if you're just more of a beginner, I think the thing you really want to do is focus on the most important stats.
Yeah.
I know you've done this on FantasyLabs, written articles where you take the fantasy points for each position and you just look at the correlations to each of the stats, and I've done the same thing on 4for4 for the daily fantasy playbook series. And it's just literally, that sometimes it's just like for running backs, it just really comes down to touches, and for wide receivers, it's like targets and target market share and red zone target market share, and things like that. And you just knowing those few key stats, the few key Vegas lines, it's like you don't have to watch. But as you get deeper and deeper, and as you get more advanced, you're going to start to come across these questions and these decisions that stats just, you could have numbers that support each side, and you just don't know. And if eventually that's where the eye test, I think, will help you the most.
Yeah, DFS is seemingly overwhelming at points, but I agree there's certain things you can do. Vegas lines, these basic stats, read 4for4 and FantasyLabs. And who knows, you might make some money this football season. It'll be great. Chris, thanks for joining us, man. It's always a pleasure having you on. We'll definitely have you on more during football season. I know it's going to be a fun one.
Oh, man. Thanks for having me, Bryan.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll talk to you guys next time.